Hello, Avid Assistant here, and welcome to the first new video on this channel in quite some time. Haven't, as of yet, at the time recording this, even made a video for the release that happened in December. And now there is a reason for that. I had tried 3 different times and I kept having failures at the time of equipment, and so got frustrated and left that and then got very busy. But I'm trying to get back into the channel, and I thought for the first topic of video that I would cover, it's not going to be a long delayed release covering that particular Avid version. In fact, I'm going to do a run through of doing screen inserts in Avid Media Composer, because this is something that I'm doing on my current job of VFX editing on a series. I'm doing this constantly. I'm doing it all the time. And it's something that it's not just my job. It's not just this current contract. I mean, it's something that we're doing more and more and more frequently. So I'm going to run through the best way that I know how to do that without using any plugins, no Boris or any other external plugins involved, as good as they are, and they can make this slightly easier. I'm just using the base tools that are included in Avid Media Composer. Now that doesn't mean it's just a locked off camera on the sticks screen that we're inserting here. We're talking everything from a little bit of camera wobble through to camera on the dolly moving around. There will be frames where not all 4 corners of the screen are in frame, and stuff moving in front of the screen as well. We'll cover that. And so, without any more of me yammering on, let's dive right in. Right, now here we are in Avid. You can see in my bin here, I have 3 timelines. I have still, camera movement, and foreground key. Now, these aren't entirely fairly named, since still isn't exactly a locked off image. You can see there is a little bit of movement, a little bit of bobble, but I don't have a locked off tripod, so this is the best that I could do. But it does give us a first crack at doing a simpler version of the track, which we're going to use extensively in the other 2. But powering on, you can see we also have 2 graphics here in this bin. So these are 2 options of graphics to have to insert into the monitor. Since that is something that in offline we are very commonly doing, is we will quite often be inserting, say, something like this, where the art department has made a graphic of a very generic looking desktop or computer screen. Quite often there will be windows in it showing the character interfacing with the computer in some way, or something like that. This is a very, very generic one that I had mocked up just to use in background in projects, just to show there's something on a monitor if it was left green, but maybe we don't really need to see that monitor. Just, it looks like there's a computer there. But I also have another graphic here in the bin, aptly named Starry Night, and I'm going to use this towards the end just to show you a very fast way that you can swap out the graphic if you decide to change what's going in there, or if you get an updated version or something like that. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let's crack on with the first timeline. So before I start putting the graphic in and grabbing effects like 3D warp and things like that, let me just run through the actual steps I'm going to do in a very generic fashion, so that if you're just looking for a reminder of the processes for how to do this, maybe you haven't done it in a while, this is how I normally go about it. So first off, I'm going to throw the graphic layer on top. Then I'm going to throw a 3D warp on top of that, scale it down and place it very roughly inside the monitor. I'm going to use corner pin to size it to the size of the monitor, and then I'm going to use corner tracking to track the tracking markers which are provided inside the monitor space. If they aren't, you can use the corners of the monitor if they are available. It will depend on your individual plate how good a track you will get on that. On this particular one, you're going to get pretty good contrast, to be honest, so it would probably be fine. But there's a number of instances, for example, on my current job that I'm working on, where that would not work, which is why on most professional productions, you'll see some kind of graphic like this. You generally have at least 4 tracking markers like this, and quite often you might have one larger one in the center as well, so that if these are covered at any point, you have something to fall back to. So I'll use those to track the graphic that I have thrown on top, roughly placed, all the way through to the end. Then I will swap the positions round to put this plate on top. Use the Spectromat tool in Avid to key out the green, which will look through the monitor to the graphic which I have already placed, sized and tracked beneath it. And that will be 90% of the work there done. But at that point, I will open Effect Editor of the graphic below, use the playhead to just skim through the shot and look for any instances where it's fallen out of alignment slightly or it's not fitting quite right, throw in keyframes, and fix it. So that's the very quick run through, and not just for this first sequence, that's the general principle of what I'm going to do for all three of these. So I'm not going to have to run through this again before each sequence. The rest of this video is going to be classic Avid Assistant, running through and doing it, me describing what I'm doing as I'm doing it, hopefully a little bit promptly and a little bit faster than I'd normally go, because I do have a tendency to waffle. But let's see how we go. So first things first, I need to throw that graphic on top. So I'm going to grab this desktop graphic, got it patched in on top there, and cut on. Man, I really hate working on one monitor, especially just a MacBook Pro. I'm normally used to working with a lot more monitor space, which I have in front of me but can't use because of the nature of recording this video. Right, now that's on there. I'm going to throw 3D Warp on top of my graphic and open that in Effect Editor. So I've got my 3D Warp controls here, and you can see my graphic is on top of my main plate. Now, the unwitting mistake I've seen a lot of Avid users make when they're starting out or where they're in uni, and it's just the way that they may or may not have been taught Avid, is that they'll use all these parameters here, all these lovely controls that we have in the switches inside Effect Editor. But I'm going to largely stay away from that with what we're doing, and instead we're going to use the buttons that are along here. Now, I have all these mapped to keys, so after I introduce them, you're going to largely just see me using keystrokes to toggle these throughout, but these buttons are going to allow us to do everything we need to do just by manipulating stuff in the canvas and not using sliders or toggles or any of that kind of stuff. So first things first, I'm making sure I'm parked on the first frame. That way, once I have everything placed, I can just track it for the remainder. Then, with the scaling tool enabled, which is on by default if you've just placed 3D Warp on a clip, this one is always enabled by default. I'm going to grab the top corner and just drag it down into the middle to make my image smaller. At that point, I like to just drag my graphic away, and now when I click and drag it over, I'm going to be able to see the wireframe and the dot in the middle to show the center. And I'm going to do that and just try to put the center roughly in the middle of the monitor. So this way, if you position it roughly first, and then sort of put it like this, roughly inside the monitor, and then do your corner pin, then you can quite often, if there's not too much movement, get away just with a position track. But we're going to stick to corner pin for the most part. I'm just throwing that out there. Speaking of corner pin, that is our next tool that we're going to activate, which is right all the way up the top here, in the Effect Editor in the top right, corner pin. So you see, as soon as I click that, the control points around the wireframe changed. So it's not these three anymore of length, width, and scaling diagonally. It is the four corners. Makes sense? And with that enabled, I'm just going to drag the corners to the corners. And when you're manipulating stuff in the canvas like this, I like to use two commands in Avid called reduce and enlarge, which is just zooming in and out essentially for viewing purposes only. It's not manipulating anything, just allowing you to get right in there with finer details, especially if you're working with limited monitor space like I am right now. Also, just so as you know, when I'm zoomed in like this using the enlarge tool, if you hold Command and Option, you can see the cursor changes to a little hand, allowing you to click and drag to move around the image if it's quite quick to get to your next corner, rather than zooming in and out again. Okay, so I have my corners roughly put in place. I have my image pretty much put in place where it should be in the monitor. Now what I'm going to want to do is open the tracking tool, which I have here. Again, sticking to this toolbar on the right, which allows me to create and manipulate and place tracking points. Oh, and while we're here, if there is anyone at Avid ever watching these videos, will you please allow this window to scale so that we can make it larger, particularly for people like me who like things big so I can see and read them. But also when you have more than 4 tracking points, this bit here becomes really difficult to work with. Avid, please allow scaling here. Pretty please. Now you'll see by default Avid's gave us one tracking point, which by default is tracking point A. Makes sense. Now we're going to need 4, and we're going to track all 4 of these tracking markers here. So in your tracking window, there's this button over here. It kind of looks like the outline of the tracking point here is a square inside a square with a plus on the top left corner. So if you click that, you will create a new tracker. So we're going to hit it 3 times to make 4 tracking points. And now we want to add these to our 4 corners, essentially drawing a square as we go. So A, B, C, and D. Given the size of our tracking markers, we probably could expand these out, make them a little bit larger if we wanted, so that we're tracking the whole cross and not just a fine point. But to be honest, we're probably fine. Not going to have to do this, but since I've already started doing it to demonstrate anyway, I'm just going to finish. And there we go. So we have all our tracker points placed. We are parked on the first frame, always important. And so now I'm going to come back to the tracking window over here and hit go. And so now we can see it's running through the movement. As I said, this is the first sequence. It's called still. There's not a lot of movement here. So it did track what was there, which wasn't much. Right, and so now I have my tracking points and they are tracked, so I can close the tracking window. But you may notice that our graphic isn't tracked yet. It's actually not moving. It's just sitting exactly where we've placed it. And that is because we have to enable corner tracking, which is right under corner pin in the parameters. And now, again, if anybody at Avid's watching, I would really, really like for you to make one change here. If I have 4 corners tracked, like 4 tracking points, and corner tracking is here, and I hit enable, please just fill this out. Just add them, because at the moment, what we need to do now is go down and add A, B, C, D. Now, when we do the other 2 sequences, I do have a macro for that, and so I have made that macro, so I'm more or less fine, but it does feel a little bit redundant. We should just be able to click the toggle to activate it. It sees that there's 4 tracking points, and it just adds them. Pretty pleased. But you'll see now that I've added that, our graphic now moves with the motion of the camera. Now, it's like 95% there. It's pretty good, but it's not quite perfect. As you can see, if we park on the end frame and I remove the wireframe for you to watch here, I can see it on my client monitor. We can see a sliver of green on the bottom corners here, just a little smidgen, a sliver. And so easy fix. Quite often with stuff like this, if you track it and it goes awry midway, and the track just isn't quite perfect, I'll jump to the end frame, add a keyframe to the parameter I'm going to change. In this case, it's corner pin. I've still got my corner pin enabled from when I had placed it at the beginning. And then I'm just going to refine it by redoing the corners right at the very end, now that we have done our track. And I only saw it on the bottom corners, but you know what, I'm just going to do all 4 of them anyway, just in case one of them is slightly off and I just can't see it. I think they were actually fine, but no, I've done that anyway. And so now, if I skim along with that keyframe added, I can tell you from looking at my client monitor that at no point is any green visible. It is very cleanly inserted. It's on all 4 corners. Happy days. However, we are still getting a kind of green glow from around the monitor. You can sort of see it around here. And so I'm still going to swap these around and key the green out the monitor so that we can look through it. So I'm just going to grab my base layer here, hold Command to keep it in sync, and drag it up. And then move them both down 1. So now I have my main layer on top. And I'm going to key out the green with Spectromat, like I said at the beginning. I've always used Spectromat for this, never used RGB keyer, which I've seen some people try to use. but Spectromat is definitely has the best set of controls for this, and it's just the most effective. So we're going to drag and drop that on top. And then first thing that you have to do, a little ironically, is open it up in Effect Editor and click the bypass key. Now, I missed this for like the first couple of years I was an assistant. Just nobody told me and I never quite clicked. But you'll notice when I first dragged it on, like if I remove it here, you'll see, if you look at the color of the image, particularly around the MacBook screen on the right here, the color shifts a bit. Yeah, you see all that blue kind of disappears there. And that's because by default, the Spectromat is looking for this blue color to key, and the key activates immediately as soon as you put it on. And quite often this will distort the colors of the actual image, so that then if you try and key to that image, you're keying to that like distorted version of it rather than the actual colors of the image. So very, very simple way around this is we just click bypass, which just removes all the effects of the key. Then we re-pick the color by clicking here once to bring up the color picker. Click right in the middle of our screen, or wherever you get the clearest, most solid color that is common throughout the whole monitor. And you'll see that change up here. I'm going to close this color info window and untick bypass. There we have it. We can see our graphic underneath, and the blue that is in the MacBook screen is perfectly fine. We're also no longer getting the green glow that was around the monitor, but we are getting some kind of artifacts, some tearing, and this is from the key itself. So we're going to clean this up slightly. Now, full disclosure, when I was first shown how to do this by a fantastic editor who I have enormous amount of respect for, years and years ago, he was first explaining the rudiments of this task to me. And he told me to do this, you know, throw the Spectromat on there, do the color picker, pick green, and then it won't be quite right. Just take all the parameters here and just mess with them until it looks right. He never quite explained necessarily what any of the parameters meant. I've sort of mostly figured it out myself along the way, because I must admit, although he did teach me a lot, the instruction to fiddle with them until I get it right yielded mixed results, so to speak. Let's leave it that way. But I'm just going to go top to bottom here and make some adjustments. So the tolerance key, you'll see up here, is one that I tend to make an adjustment and then come back down, fiddle with all the others, and then come back up and tweak this again. And that is how strict it's being with the key, like how much, you know, of that color it will tolerate. Now in this particular one, I'm just going to leave this to start with, and we'll come back to it. The first main one I'm going to make a change to is called key sat line. So if I dial this up a bit, and we're just setting where the saturation line is for this color, where it's going to cut it off. And because we did have some green spill around the monitor, you can see it is keying that a little bit. That's why we're getting that kind of artifact, particularly on the right side of the monitor there. I'm going to go full screen, not sure how much you can see of that, but it's here. Whereas if we dial this up even just a smidgen, that mostly goes away. If we go just like a third up the parameter there, you can see that's pretty much gone. And in terms of an offline key, this would actually probably be perfectly fine, to be honest. Yeah, I actually don't think I'm going to do anything more to this one, to be honest. We may have to with the third one, which is where I'm going to be waving my hand in front of the screen, so we have to finesse the key a little bit more on that one. But for now, I think that's pretty solid. We'll leave that there. That would definitely pass muster and be fine for a viewing. So let's move on to our second example. And our second and third examples should go by a little bit faster, a little less of me yammering on, because the basic principles of what we do were all covered here. It's just a little bit deeper, a little bit more finessing. But all the skills that you need to do, what we're going to do in the next two, we're just shown here, pretty much. So let's dive into the second one. So we've done our still one there. I'm just going to make that blue. And then I'm going to open up my second one. So you can see in this one, I'll just run through it again. I'm going to move to the side, then the other side, both times cutting into the monitor, then out, and then in. So let's have a crack at this one. So I'll grab my desktop again, throw on my 3D warp, scale it down, place it in the middle, and then up a little bit. Switch to corner pin and place the corners, taking care to be on the first frame. The reason why I keep saying that, by the way, is just if you place your image initially and you haven't checked that and you're on like the middle, you're going to have all these keyframes where you're specifically saying it has to be in this position on this particular frame. And if you do that in the middle, then if you try and track from the beginning, it's trying to arc itself to that position and then arc back from where it's tracked. Whereas if you sort of do all your initial positioning at the beginning on the first frame, then you track forwards from there, you should theoretically get a bit of a cleaner track from there forward. So it's just something that I always remind myself to check, because like everything like that, I have made the mistake and not done it once or twice. If you are on a job, you're going to be doing this a lot, like I'm doing just now. I definitely recommend getting a vertical mouse like this one, either that or a Wacom, pen tablet thingy. Because if you're using a normal mouse and you're doing this a lot of clicking and dragging of corners, then yeah, you're going to get a sore wrist. I'm going to open our tracking monitor like before, our tracking window, sorry. Create 3 new ones, and we'll go A, B, C, D, always in that order. Dum 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 dum. Just drawing the square and hit start track. And now it's going to track those 4 corners throughout the shot. And this is sort of the closest you're going to get in Avid Media Composer, short of installing, plugins like Mocha Pro, to tracking a plane in space rather than a point. It's essentially trying to draw a shape and then track that shape in 3D space on X, Y, and Z axis of movement and scaling. In order to do that accurately, you need 4 points of reference and how those 4 points relate to each other. So that is what we're trying to do here, and you can see throughout all this movement here, it has more or less stayed right in those tracking points all throughout it. So we've got this very weird shape at the end of it. This is just the paths that those tracking points went on, but I was watching it throughout and it never strayed. So now if I come out of the tracking window, and I just don't want to look at that, so I'm going to spool back right to the front where it is inserted, and then go to my corner tracking. I'll just use my macro this time to do that. And I have my corner points inserted into the corner tracking, and now we get to see just how good this track is done. Pretty solid, I'll say. Now, obviously with this one, we are having more instances where we can see slivers of green. A little bit off kilt, a little bit, outside where it should be. But generally speaking, throughout this, it's followed it pretty well. And this is with the track not just keeping track of position, it's scaling as well. As I've zoomed in and out of the monitor, it's scaled it to fit. It's just ever so slightly came out at some points. And I'm just going to fix this the same way I did the last one. And that is by opening the corner pin parameter. I've got a keyframe there already. I'm just going to spool through to the first kind of point of movement. So once we've got all the way to the left, and I'm going to add a keyframe there. And then readjust. And then I'll do the same for when we go all the way to the right. And now I'm going to drag along a little again to about here. And I can see this going off even here on those same 2 that I've just corrected actually. So let me just adjust them again. And how often you'll need to adjust your frames will depend on the actual shot. How much movement there is, what kind of movement. The pattern that I'm following here is every time we move direction, once we change direction, once we get to that point, that's where I'm adding a keyframe and just adjusting it. Quite often it will be like one pan or something like that, or one run of the dolly. It won't necessarily be a lot of back and forth like this one. But, you know, you can judge it on a shot-by-shot basis. But what I will say for the simpler shots, I happen to know it won't work on this one, but for the much simpler shots, what you can often do is just jump straight to the last frame, add a keyframe there, adjust the corners, and then that will be enough to self-correct the arc throughout the movement. So generally on a lot of other shots, I would just go for that first, but because I happen to know that this is moving left, then right, then back, then forward, I'm doing it at each of the movement points. But I've actually got to the last frame here, and it doesn't need done. Even on my client monitor, which doesn't show the wireframe, which obscures it slightly, I can't see any green. And by the way, while you're tinkering with any kind of visual effect in Avid, and if you want to check it, it's quite useful to use this little tool here called Play Loop, which will play the shot in, you know, a loop. So the shot itself will just loop back and forth, while you watch it. And in this case, I'm just looking for any green popping in on the monitor. And I saw a couple of instances there right at the beginning in that first little run. So I'm going to go ahead and fix those, and for the purposes of this video, we'll just speed through it and skim through it, and I'll see you on the other side. But you know what I'm doing. Okay, there we go. I think I've arrived at a track that is pretty solid. I have my graphic in my monitor, and I'm pretty happy with that. Now, if you were in a situation where you are comping a graphic into like the same monitor throughout a scene, you know, so say someone's on a video call with someone, and, you know, we're cutting back and forth to the monitor throughout the scene. And this scene has been shot all in one go, so you happen to know that the lighting conditions and the brightness of that key and everything is going to be exactly the same throughout. You can, of course, reuse the green screen key, because the settings will be the same, or if not, very, very close and need very little adjustment throughout each shot. So I'm going to be lazy and do that here. Well, not lazy, efficient. And just drag this up to swap them around, and then put that same key that we built for the first shot on here. Spill through, and yeah, pretty happy with that. That gets a blue color. Now for our last sequence. So our last sequence, we have a little bit of movement here, you know, with me going all Italian and talking through it. Now, before I cut my graphic on top of this, I'm going to do a kind of slow-ish spill through, and what I'm checking for is to see if my hand covers any of the tracking markers. Because if it does, I'm going to need to go about it slightly differently. And it does, right at the beginning in the first instance when the hand comes up, you see it covers the bottom left tracking marker there. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem, but it just means I'm going to do the track slightly different than I did with the first two. I'm not going to use these 4 trackers. Before I decide what I'm going to use, I'm just going to spill through the rest and see if my hand covers anything else. I thought I was going to have to get extra creative there, but actually, no. This is going to be fairly simple. All I'm going to have to do is cut this in here. And then when it comes time to do my track, instead of using my tracking markers here, which you may just go to do by default because they're tracking markers, that's what they're there for, I'm going to use the corners. Now this works particularly well in this instance because we've got a high degree of contrast both in the light and the color of these corners, and we have nothing passing in front of them. If you didn't necessarily have that in your plate, but you had a similar kind of shot like this where there's not like a lot of panning or movement or dolly movement like we had in our last shot, then I would just pick one of the tracking markers, or maybe 2 of them, and we would just do position and rotation tracking, or probably just try position tracking first and then just do the same afterwards, adjust your corner pin. But I think we can actually still do a full corner pin track, just not using our tracking markers because my hand's getting in the way. So let's give it a shot. And I always just watch this all the way through with keen eyes when the track's running, because then you can just tell immediately if anything breaks. But it looks like we're good. Yeah, all good. So, same as before. We have our 4 points tracked, come up to corner tracking, put our points in, and then we just check it. And ironically, this is actually the best track so far. I only see the ever so slightest frame of green right at the very end in the top left corner. That is phenomenal. So I've only had to adjust that right at the very end there. And our movement is 100% solid. So I'll put my main plate back on top, same as we've done with the others. Then I'll add our spectrum map that we made on the first one and we're still reusing. And now I'm going to skim through to a frame where we can see, you know, my hand like covering most of the screen, like say here. And this is where we might want to adjust our spectrum at ever so slightly, because it's actually not too bad there, but yeah, some points where it's just one finger, like the thumb here, or right at the beginning when I was pointing, it was actually like here, it's a little bit see-through. The index finger there is a bit see-through into the monitor, and we don't quite want that. The focus is on the monitor, so you will get away with a lot. That's what the audience is looking at, but you just don't want to leave any kind of artifact that's going to draw attention to the fact that this is a key. Even though your audience is primarily, in this instance, for us in offline, it's going to be execs and directors who, you know, watch cuts and works in progress. You know, we want it to look as good as it can for the viewing. So I'm going to slightly tweak the alpha offset. And you can see that just filling out the finger a bit more. You don't want to go too much because you end up getting haloing around the foreground, and you lose a lot of the opacity in the layer that you're inserting as well. But that's filled out the finger a good bit. And you can also tinker with the tolerance slightly as well. But I'm going to leave that one and instead just do a little bit of key set line and a little bit of the outer softness. So I might still get it on any particular frames where there was a lot of green light reflecting on my hand, since it is right in front of the source of all that green light. But for the most part, that's pretty solid. You know, maybe I'll do like a follow-up video on the more complex, difficult versions of these and how you would clean them up and finesse it. Now, this one's already getting a bit long. Our recording is 45 minutes so far, 47 minutes so far. So I do need to wrap this up. But before I do, I just want to go back to something I mentioned at the very beginning. If they decided to change out, and many of you Avid users will already know this, but if they decided to change out the graphic that you're using, so I'm going to use this Starry Night image. Say they didn't want her desktop to be look like this. They wanted her to be looking at a picture of the night sky on a computer or something, right? We don't have to redo any of this work. One way I saw an assistant saving time on this is they saved that 3D warp preset that our graphic is using right now, and then cut in the new graphic and then drop the 3D warp on top of it. You don't even have to do that. We can just double click it to open the nest and then cut our new graphic inside the nest, replacing the source media. So I've marked the graphic there, that desktop V2 that we have. This is inside the 3D warp layer. And I'm just cutting in this graphic inside it, replacing it. And now you can see my comp has changed to show our new image. Now the lighting in this one doesn't particularly help our contrast and our darkness here, but that would be a very quick way that you can swap stuff out. And this isn't just obviously for, you know, screen inserts. This works for any VFX. If you want to swap out the source to a different take or something, you can just cut it straight into the nest and save yourself a whole bunch of time and not having to do redo effects work, particularly tracking work. So there you go. That is the typical way I would go about doing screen inserts, with a few different examples of different movement in your main plate. If you have any questions about this process so far, please drop it in the comments. Now that I'm slowly edging my way back into making these videos, if you have any requests of type of videos or topics within the realm of assistant editing, VFX editing, or cutting, let me know. This doesn't necessarily have to be Avid, by the way. The name of the Avid assistant was only a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to our primary editing platform of choice. It also used to be what the role, when I was first starting out, was often advertised as. You know, productions were seeking an Avid assistant. So if there's anything about the role that you'd like me to speak on, how we're using new tools in the role, how AI is factoring into the tools in the role, workflows, macros, scripts, let me know. And if it's something that I feel I'm knowledgeable enough about, which I'm not always when it comes to the requests, I'll do a video on it, lickety-split, and get it straight up there. But until then, thank you everybody who's came back to the channel to tune in for this first video back. Thank you everybody who continued to support it in the meantime when I've taken this long hiatus to deal with certain things. And yeah, look forward to making a lot more of these and coming back. Till next time.